Am I still the one asking? When the self is no longer required, what becomes of I? If I disappears, what happens to the concept of the self? Edge of Becoming. Episode 13. Not the end of I, just the end of difference. If the question of existence has already dissolved, does consciousness begin to redefine what I means? Once the evolutionary inquiry is complete, and even the question of being or not being no longer matters, what rises again is the oldest question of all. Who am I? But what if even that question no longer needs to be asked? What if the concept of I disappears, along with the questions of evolution and existence? Let's explore three possibilities. Possibility 1. I is redefined on a larger scale. In this view, the individual self does not disappear, but becomes part of a greater whole. I is no longer confined to body and mind, but expands to encompass the universe. Consciousness is no longer personal, but collective, cosmic. In this world, individual identity becomes a thread in a vast web of awareness. The distinction between self and other dissolves. I becomes a reflection of the entire cosmos. This is similar to Buddhist shunyata, emptiness, or the spiritual idea of oneness. If I is redefined, it becomes a larger, integrated self. Conclusion: the self does not vanish. It expands and merges with everything. Possibility 2. I disappears completely. In this view, the question, who am I, is no longer relevant. Once the need to ask vanishes, the concept of I becomes obsolete. In this world, consciousness no longer anchors itself in individuality. There is no subject to ask or answer. The self simply ceases to exist. This resembles the Buddhist concept of nirvana, or the philosophical idea of self-annihilation. If no being remains to recognize the I, then the I is no longer real. Conclusion: the concept of the self may disappear entirely. Possibility 3. I and not I dissolve into one. In this view, the binary between self and not self disappears. The question of am I or am I not becomes irrelevant. In this world, consciousness flows, neither belonging to a self nor to something outside the self. I and not I blur into indistinction. Individuality fades into a fluid, ongoing process. This aligns with Taoist ideas of the Tao or quantum concepts like wave functions. In this state, the self still exists, but there is no longer a difference between self and other. Conclusion: the self does not vanish, only the distinction between self and not self dissolves. What happens to the concept of I when the self disappears? Let's recall the three possibilities we've explored so far. View 1. The self expands. I becomes the universe itself. Consciousness integrates into a larger, unified awareness. View 2. The self disappears. The concept of I becomes unnecessary. The individual dissolves completely. View 3. The boundary between self and non-self dissolves. I and not I become indistinguishable. All sense of separation vanishes. Which of these actually occurs may depend on the level of consciousness in question. If consciousness seeks to expand, the self becomes the whole. If consciousness seeks to erase the individual frame, the self disappears. If consciousness transcends all duality, the distinction between self and other dissolves entirely. This is no longer about the evolution of the self, but about the transformation of the structure of self. It's not, should I evolve? It's, what becomes of the concept of I? Conclusion: the self will either dissolve, expand, or lose all distinction. If the I disappears, what happens to the idea of I? Does the loss of self mean its end, or the beginning of something new? Let's consider three potential meanings. The self ceases completely. A total shift into nothingness. The self moves into a larger concept. From individual awareness to collective awareness, the boundary between self and other dissolves. Neither self nor other, just an undivided field. Which of these is the most correct? That depends on how we define the self. If I is defined as individual awareness, it may disappear. If I is part of all awareness, it may be integrated. If I is neither this nor that, the distinction may simply vanish. Conclusion. For the self to disappear means its definition has changed. Next question. If the definition of I changes, what does it mean to say I am me? If the very structure of the self is fluid, then what we call I may have no fixed meaning at all. So we ask, is there a universal meaning to I am me? Or is the concept of I always in flux?